This presentation looks at the liberal reforms of the early 20th century. There were several underlying reasons why these reforms came about. There was the pioneering research into poverty by people like Booth in London and Rowntree in York. There was the German economic growth that threatened Britain's financial supremacy in Europe. There were the problems of finding fit and healthy recruits for the Boer War at the turn of the century. All of these combined with other factors and the threat of the new Labour Party, causing many liberals such as Lloyd George and Churchill to advocate reform as a necessity to win over voters and to secure Britain's place in the world. After the 1906 election victory, Henry Campbell Bannerman was Prime Minister for 2 years. But the key figures in the reforms were Asquith, Prime Minister from 1908 onwards, David Lloyd George, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Winston Churchill, President of the Board of Trade. The reforms themselves spanned the years 1906 to 1912 and covered legislation around assisting vulnerable groups in society. Children, the elderly, those who were sick, and the unemployed. Legislation for children began with the School Meals Act in 1906. This provided for free hot meals to be supplied to children in school by local councils. Not all councils responded, but many did, leading to weight and health improvements for many children. In 1907, school medical inspections were introduced, in which every child got a yearly medical check. However, any treatment required still needed payment until 1912. Then, in 1908, the Children's Act introduced a range of legislation, giving children special status as protected persons. For the first time, child abuse, neglect, and ensuring children's lives became illegal. Child courts and borstalls were established so that children would not have to attend the adult versions. For the elderly, 1908 saw the introduction of the Old Age Pensions Act. This was offered to those who were over 70 years of age at the rate of 5 shillings a week to single people and 7 shillings and sixpence a week to married couples. For many, it removed the threat of the workhouse and the fear of being reliant on their families. But you had to have lived in the country for the past 20 years. You had to have less than £31 a year to qualify, and it could be refused to those who had not worked hard enough in their working lives. For the unemployed, the Labour Exchanges Act in 1909 set up places for employers to advertise jobs and workers to find them. This was a successful and useful measure, with 83 exchanges being set up in 1910 alone. For the sick, the National Insurance Act Part 1 in 1911 set up an insurance scheme in which workers paid in 4p a week, employers paid in 3p, and the government added another 2p. For this payment, when workers fell ill, they received 10 shillings a week for up to 26 weeks, and a 5 shillings a week disability pension if they were unable to return to work. The National Insurance Act Part 2 in 1912 turned its attention again to the unemployed. It was aimed at helping seasonal workers, like those in the shipbuilding trade. For a similar payment into the scheme, when unemployed, those who belonged to the scheme could claim 7 shillings a week unemployment pay for up to 15 weeks. However, all of these reforms needed to be paid for. So how were they financed? Well, in 1909, David Lloyd George introduced what he called the People's Budget. In it, he introduced a raft of legislation increasing taxes on the wealthy, raising duties on tobacco and spirits, and introducing tax on the profit from selling land. Wealthy landowners, largely conservative, were heavily against these reforms, and the largely Tory House of Lords refused to pass the budget. This caused a constitutional crisis, which eventually led to the curbing of the powers of the House of Lords. This presentation has covered just some of the many reforms introduced by the Liberal government of 1906 to 1914. These changes paved the way for our modern welfare state and changed the life of both ordinary people in Britain, as well as changing the way Britain is governed today.